Hi, in this video we're going to continue working on our eye shader, so this is where we left. I'm starting to like the way the refraction looks. Now let's start to bring in some reflections to see how this changes. So I'm just going to move things a little bit around. I'm going to close this tab in the meanwhile and open my reflection amount. So let's just bring some reflection all the way up. And since we have different IORs and those are being controlled by our marble and solid fractal procedural texture. For this one time, I'm just going to tell it to use the Fresnel. And what that's going to use, since this is locked to the refraction IR, is that we're going to have a different index of refraction for reflections based on that procedural texture. So that should work very well. With that completely turned on, the other thing is that I want to make sure it reflects on the backside. I want to be able to have internal reflections. So let's render and see what happens. Okay, so this change was very subtle. We have some change you can see, especially on this face, since it's not directly facing the camera, we can have some reflection. One of the other things I want to do before I continue on my refraction is that I want my refraction to affect the shadows. That way, this refraction over here is not being from an object completely occluded, but there's some light coming through and illuminating this area. So I'm going to come down to my refraction and turn it to affect my shadows. That way, when light comes in, it goes through the object and illuminates this object based on that refraction. And that's going to make my overall, especially this area, it's the part where the ice cube is sitting on, it's going to make it look a little bit more realistic. So I'm just going to do tiny changes, render, tiny changes, render, and eventually we'll get to the final shader. Okay, that's starting to look a lot better. This is what I was talking about. We'll fix all this with sampling and when we start getting some glossiness in the reflection. But this is starting to look really good. One of the things that still really bothers me, it's the shape of my eye cube. It's a perfect cube. You will never get a cube like that. But if you select my cube, you can notice that I put some edge loops on the edges, like if we were going to divide it. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to just apply the quick subdivision node, like a V-Ray subdivision node to it. So we'll get some round edges, and that's going to give it a lot more realism. But before we continue moving, let's start working on our reflection glossiness. So I'm going to take this guy, duplicate it once more, move it here, and this is going to be called reflex glossy. And now I want to have my glossy, maybe I can change values, so I can tell it, like, instead of using a reverse node to inverse the values, I can just change the output here. So maybe I can tell it to this be 1 and this be 0.85, or maybe lower this a tiny bit, 9.5. Connect these to my reflection glossiness and see what happens. Out value, reflection glossiness, there we go. And another thing you've probably noticed, as we start adding nodes and connecting parameters, our render times are increasing exponentially. That's something that happens with very complex shaders. So one quick trick that I'm going to do to reduce my render times slightly, it's not the best thing, but it helps a lot in this kind of test sense, is that if you go to your render settings, if you go to settings, I'm going to lower the size of my buckets to maybe something like 16. This will prevent large buckets being stuck in areas where there's a lot of sampling. And another thing I want to do before I forget is just bring my refraction here, refraction pass, so we can see at the refraction by itself. There we go. And let's re-render this. Okay, this is starting to look better and better and better. Maybe I can change a little bit the refraction amount. I don't want these areas to be so non-refractive, but I'm really starting to like the way these look. So to subdivide our mesh, so it started looking a little bit better, I mean, you could apply a smooth modifier or something like that. But if you just select the mesh and go to in the shape tab, if you go to attributes V-Ray and just click on subdivision, it's almost like if you're gonna use displacement, but we're not using any map. It's just going to subdivide it before displacement, but we're actually not going to use any displacement map. So because we have our edge loops in the correct parts, it's just going to subdivide as a soft cube. Let's re-render that and see how it looks. Okay, that's our render. It's starting to look really, really, really nice, but you probably noticed the moment we subdivided the mesh using the V-Ray subdivisions node, our render time seriously increased. We can actually lower that. If we come down to V-Ray extra attributes, we'll have these render subdivisions, and we would need to add an extra subdivisions quality, bring it down, and I don't know, just bring this down to maybe 64 or something like that. That will give us some less subdivisions and work better with this. But let's keep looking at, this is a shading tutorial. I don't want to pay too much attention to my V-Ray other nodes. Starting to look really good. We have some internal reflections, we have some internal glossiness, we have some tiny bit of specular. If you come here and look at the specular, we have a tiny bit in the refraction, we have some internal speculars, and our reflection is very subtle, but it's starting to look really good. So maybe one thing I want to change just to see how it looks is take this node, this remap node, and we had it so that dark parts would give us like more clear reflections and the white parts will give us this. Let's try to adjust these values just to see what happens. Maybe 0.925 and here 0.8. And if we don't like the result, we can always switch these two values. I'm here just playing, but usually this is the way I build my ice shaders. So let's just re-render maybe this part. Okay, so this is starting to look better and better and better. Another thing we can do just to add a tiny bit of realism is come and bring this guy down and maybe apply some bump. Just break a little bit that evenness of the surface. So I can always come, bring this guy here, tell it to be my bump map, and then look down for my bump controls. Okay, here, and bring this value all the way down, maybe like 0.01 or something like that. I just want to have a tiny bit of bump. Get an area, render, and see how it looks. Okay, so this is looking really good. I really like the result of this. I think we have great texture. We have great changes of refraction and great changes of reflection. One other thing we could do is that if we bring, let me bring my blend somewhere over here, we could add an extra layer of parts that are way more wet or way more refractive than what we already have. So I'm going to take this guy, I'm going to duplicate it without the rest of the connections, and I'm going to call this, I don't know, melting part. Let's come and change our reflection. This is good. This is good. We can maybe put this at 95. We want it to be way more clear. And our refraction, we can make it just 100% refractive with no glossiness at all. So it's pretty much like a water material. And what we might change is change a little bit of our index of refraction just to force that extra effect. So I'm going to plug it on top of it as my code material number 1. And then I'm going to bring this guy here. And I might use this guy as our mask. So I'm going to create another remap. Duplicate connection networks. I'm going to call this melting amount. And I'm going to call this maybe, what I'm going to change are my output values maybe from 0.25 to 0. So we get on the dark parts, we get more water, and on the white parts, we get no water whatsoever. If we don't like that, we can always invert these values. But I don't want to add too much water. I just want to add tiny parts of it. So connect my values, add value to my blend amount RGB. Maybe get a bigger piece and render. Okay, here's our render. You've noticed we are using just a lot of different ways to use the same procedural textures and how to apply it to different values. So this is like a 100% procedural shader. I'm gonna stop here because I don't want this video to become too long. But just other tips you could do for something like that. Maybe you could map this into a ramp and apply that like with between two very subtle blues and apply that ramp to be your fog and have a very low value for fog, but that way will give us like a bluish tint in the refraction. The other thing you could do is that create another remap node and have some values maybe between 0 and 0.1 and apply it to a displacement shader and connect it to your shading group. Things like that will really make this shader look nicer. But I just wanted to quickly show you a way to get a procedural texture, modify it several times so we could control index of refraction, refraction glossiness, reflection glossiness, refraction amounts, etc., etc., etc. So now with this done, I'm going to save this as 11end. And we will continue on the next video.